So this machine right here, this is a slot mortiser. Um, it's kind of like a combination of a mortise press and a drill press, where it can plunge straight in, that's how I'm going to use it. But also for its more typical use, as it's plunging in, it can also move side to side, creating those longer mortises that you might need in different situations. In this case, these make round mortises as opposed to the mortise press, which makes these square mortises. So right here, what you'll see as I go in, I'm going in a little bit, then backing out to clear out the wood shavings. If I don't do that, what happens is the bit starts heating up. When bits heat up too much, that's kind of when they start warping. So it's just a simple straight drill right in. We're boring out the material. After that's done, I will go back towards the end of the video and I will be tapping the holes, which means adding in all of the threads for the screws. So this machine, this was my first time using it actually, and it's really nice to use. No, we don't have one in the shop. But with that said, you theoretically, if you were doing something like this, could use a drill press. It would be a very interesting clamping situation, but I'm sure there's a way that it could be done. So the important thing with this machine is making sure you are dead center with your measurements. So there's a lot of time spent getting this set up before it's actually run. There's that plywood block off to the side that's being used as both a fence and a stop block to make sure everything is registered in the exact same place. The front of the table where the piece is going in against, that is an elevated piece of steel, so that, again, it stops it at the same position every single time. You'll notice after I unclamp something, I'm blowing off all of the sawdust from the table. If you don't do that, over time, your piece will start sitting on sawdust and then it won't be the right elevation, so you'll be off. Once I've bored out all the holes on the end grain, now I'm switching over to boring out the holes going through the faces. The ones in the end grain are actually going to have the threads going into them. The ones on the faces, the bolts are just going to go through them. So these ones are drilled out slightly larger. The end grain ones were drilled out at just below a quarter of an inch. I forget the exact measurement. These ones are being drilled out just above a quarter of an inch. I believe this one was like 17/64ths of an inch. Once these are bored out, you'll see I'm going to change the bit and put in a countersink bit. So the countersink bit, what that will do is basically carve out a small cone on the face of the wood. That way the head of the bolt can sit flush with the face. It's a little tricky for this setup because I've got different length pieces that need to be drilled in different spots, so I can't make kind of a universal setup and know that this is the stop block I need to use. I need to change the setup a few times. If I was doing this again, I would probably do a larger run of these tables. That way, instead of just doing 2 pieces and then change the setup, I could do, say, 10 pieces and then change the setup. In general, when you're making things, doing one-offs isn't really the most efficient way to do things. That's why if you think about like production scale, people are going to be making multiples of the same thing. That way, it takes a little bit longer to cut everything, but the majority of your time is generally spent setting up the machines. So if you have the same setup for a number of pieces, it's only going to take you, say, 10 minutes longer to cut everything versus the 15-20 minutes it took to set the things up. So you can start building an efficiency there as you up the amount of pieces you're making. So one thing I did since I had to change this so many times, is I kept a reference piece. What I did the initial setup on, I kept that. That way every time I had to change the bit to the countersink bit, I could plug that piece back in and check that the depth of the bit was at the same place. Here, this is what the countersink actually looks like. And if we slot the bolt in, you should see it pretty much sits flush with the face. So another thing to pay attention to as you have to change the bits multiple times, not only do you want to try and get them in the exact same depth each time, you need to make sure they're going in straight every time. If the bit's not straight, one, it's going to throw off where it's making contact with the wood, but as it rotates, it's not going to be drilling out a straight hole. It's going to be making kind of like an elliptical hole, which is going to make it wider than you need it to be. So it's going to be a loose fitting hole. Again, like I was saying, if I could do this again, I would do a larger run. That way, there's less constant changing of the bit. There's still the same amount of changing, but you're able to do a few extra pieces each one to make sure everything is absolutely perfect. Alright, so now that all the holes have been bored out, now we're going to switch over to the drill press, to a drill with a tapping bit. Like I said, tapping is simply adding the threads to the holes that we've bored out. So for this, you're going to go you're going to go very slowly, go a little bit into the hole, and then put the drill in reverse back out of it to clean the hole out. You've got kind of one shot to get this right. After you've backed out, then you're gonna manually thread that back onto the bit to make sure you're in the exact same spot. If you don't do that, you kind of run the risk of what's called cross threading, where your threads don't start in the same place, so they kind of overlap each other, and it's no longer a clean thread. If you do that, you'll end up having to switch to a larger bit. The hole won't be as snug anymore. So this is something that you should kind of take your time, and it's not difficult. It's a little time consuming. All right, so here I'm just hand threading one of the bolts in, just checking to make sure everything is good. I don't tighten it all the way. I'm just really checking to make sure the threads are grabbing on sufficiently, making sure this is the correct size bit that I'm using. Because it would be a shame to go through doing all of them to realize that it was too small, say. Once that is done and I've confirmed it's the right size, then I'm going to go through and finish tapping all of the holes that I just bored out. So again, for this video, there were two main things that were happening. There were, three main things. There were boring out the holes on the end grain, which is just clearing out a cylinder of material. Then there was boring out the holes on the faces and countersinking those. The countersinking allows the bolts to sit flush with the face. And then the final step was tapping the holes that are on the end grain. Again, tapping means adding the threads to them. Once this is all done, I didn't have enough screws to actually do a full dry assembly. I had to order more, but I was able to get most of them, or at least the kind of critical pieces that hold things off of the ground together to get a dry fit to make sure everything lined up nicely.